မြို့ထဲမှာကိုလက်ဝင်ပြစ်တာပထမတော့သူတို့ဝင်လာတာပါသူတို့ကဘ누구လက်ဖက်နဲ့ဘယ်ဝလက်ဖက်နဲ့ဆိုပြီးတော့နောက်ဘက်ဆုံးတော့ဘယ်သူမှမအကုန်လုံးသူတို့ကလိုက်ပြစ်တော့တာပဲ
The situation currently taking place in Myanmar is abominable. There's no safety anywhere, and the world has all but turned its back on an entire people trying to claim their freedom and insist upon their human rights in the face of blatant evil and inhumanity. International media seems to have moved on to the next story, scarcely reporting on this one anymore, even as the horror continues. We at Insight Myanmar Podcast find this intolerable, and we stand by the Burmese people and their courageous effort to live in dignity. This platform is dedicated to making sure that we keep the conversation going while ensuring these voices continue to be heard. Today's guest is one of those, and I invite you to settle in and open to what follows.
ပထမတစ်ခါတော့ကျွန်တော်တို့အတန်လေးစကြတော့အိမ်မှာကျွန်တော်ဟိုပေါ့ကျင်းမုံတူးထားရှိတယ်နော်ကျင်းမုံထဲမှာကျွန်တော်တို့ဝင်နေတယ်ရွာမှာကျတော့တိုက်ပွဲဖြစ်တော့ဖြစ်တဲ့ပဲဆက်လင်ကြောင်းတွေရောပြစ်နေတာပဲလေရင်လဲလာတယ်အိမ်နေထိတယ်လက်နက်ကြီးထိတယ်အိမ်နေပြိုတော့
Why do we fight, you say? We fight so that no man, woman, or child will be put to death for wanting the rights they deserve. Why must we pay with our lives for something as simple as freedom?
တရက်ထဲပဲပြေးကြတာအိုးသူကြံငါကြံနဲ့ကြံဟိုရောက်တော့ခါပြေးတဲ့နေရာမြေဝါခီရောက်တော့ခါသူကြံခဲ့လို့ပါကူညီပါသားသမီးတွေကြံခဲ့လို့အမေတွေကြံခဲ့လို့တက်ကြီးရွယ်ဦးတွေကြံခဲ့လို့နဲ့လေပြေးအားညံ့နေတာအပြန်ကြိုပေးရတယ်အပြန်ကြိုရဲလိုက်စားရတယ်တချို့ဆို3-4ရက်မှအထင်းနဲ့တတူတူ3-4ရက်မှတပြန်ကြိုရတယ်တချို့မိဘတွေကြံခဲ့သူကလေးလေးတွေကြံခဲ့တယ်အဲ့လိုပေါ့
So welcome back to another episode of Inside Myanmar. Today we are joined by Matt Wells, who's the Deputy Director for the Amnesty Crisis Response Team, who's going to be talking about the work and the research that Amnesty has been doing with regards to the ongoing humanitarian crisis in Myanmar. So Matt, thank you for joining us. Would you care to introduce yourself a little bit more broadly to the audience?
Yeah, thank you for having me. So I'm part of a team at Amnesty, the crisis response team, that specializes in investigating human rights violations, crimes under international law, and in situations of armed conflict or other major human rights crises. So we work around the world to document war crimes and other violations like that. And in particular, a colleague and I have been working for much of this year on the conflicts in eastern Myanmar, in documenting crimes by the Myanmar military against civilians there. And it follows on work that I've done in the past on crimes against the Rohingya population in Rakhine State, war crimes in Kachin and Northern Shan State by the military, and also crimes against the ethnic Rakhine population in the context of the conflicts with the Arakan army. And so it's work that we have come across in Myanmar again and again and again over the last 5 years.
And I think it's something that really bears repeating, that from the outside perspective, we look at Myanmar, we say, well, it's a country in crisis, but it's significantly more complex than that. The crises that unfold in the different parts of Shan State, Kachin State, Chin Rakhine, and Karen Karenni states are actually very different crises. They're very different conflicts with very different histories and sort of cultural impetus. So I think it is useful then to note that just because we're talking about the crisis in one part of the country, that does not mean that we're necessarily developing a better understanding of the crisis in other part of the country or coming up with solutions to that. So with that in mind, could you tell us a little bit about the background? Like what has Myanmar been like from a humanitarian perspective under the military, particularly in these border regions over the last couple of decades?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really good point you make, and of course, in addition to the complexities in different parts of the country and that relate to different ethnic minorities and their efforts for decades for greater autonomy and for respect for their rights, you also now have the situation, in the aftermath of the coup in February last year. And so there are many layers of what's happening right now in different parts of the country. But one commonality, one thing that we do see across different regions is patterns of crimes by the Myanmar military against civilians. They resort to very similar tactics again and again. And so what we've seen in Amnesty's work now for several decades in Myanmar is often a resort to collective punishment of civilians. So instead of operations going after ethnic armed groups or other fighters, the military often sets its sights on entire civilian populations in these areas, people that it perceives to support ethnic armed groups or to provide some sort of assistance to them. And so often then in the way that it fires artillery or mortars, and the way that it sweeps up people, often just on the basis of their ethnicity in arrests, and then subject them to torture and other abuses, and the way that they cut off or make extremely difficult the movement of humanitarian assistance into these areas, ethnic minority areas across the country. And we see this resort to very similar brutal tactics that consistently violate international law and that subject civilians in these areas to really horrific abuses again and again.
I mean, certainly this is the sort of story that we've seen play out in a lot of other countries, typically in the context of terrorist groups like ISIS. So it's very disheartening to see it playing out in Myanmar as well. Would you say, though, has there been any quote unquote positive impact for the military from this? Has this just unbridled assault on civilian populations actually resulted in territorial gains for the military, or a reduction in counter-military insurgencies around the country?
I think the short answer is no, in that we have seen really now a proliferation of armed groups and of an uprising against the military, particularly in the aftermath of the coup, with the rise of the PDFs in many parts of the country now operating alongside many of the long-standing ethnic armed organizations. So I think today the military is fighting on more fronts than it has in a really long time, and it's finding an enormous swath of the population that is now in active opposition to it, whether that be in forms of civil disobedience and kind of the incredible protests and efforts being made by civilians across the country since the coup, or whether that be in more and more people now taking up arms in the fight for their rights and against the military. And so I think the military in many ways sees a bigger threat today than it has in a long time, and in response to that, it's in the way that it commits these abuses. It is furthering that more and more, because again it's treating entire populations as if they are the enemy, as if it is appropriate to target them, when of course it's clear under international law and otherwise that that's absolutely forbidden, and yet they continue to resort to that. I think in terms of, at times, the military has, and we saw this in our work in Eastern Myanmar, at times the military will have success in a particular operation in which it's trying to take a very specific road or control some sort of route for a period of time. But in doing so, it is then burning villages. It is forcibly displacing tens of thousands of people from villages. It is firing indiscriminately in ways that are killing large numbers of civilians and injuring many more, and devastating civilian infrastructure, homes and hospitals and schools and all sorts of civilian property throughout these areas. And in so doing, it while it may take a road in the short term, it's showing that its only resort is to these sorts of brutal tactics that over the long run are driving people away from the military and in a desperate desire to see change and to see the consolidation of the rule of law and a respect for human rights across the country.
And so we know from just years and years of experience that the military does not care about the condemnation of the international community. They don't really care about international law. They've certainly done their best to shirk responsibility by refusing to sign the Rome Statute and become subject to the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court, for example. But why? The obvious question has to be, why does the military continue to double down on this mentality of to put it very simplistically, we are entitled by the mandate of heaven to rule, and anybody who does not recognize that needs to be punished into at least respecting that, when it has objectively not worked for them. It has objectively not brought them strategic benefits. And indeed, I would argue that following 1988, and even as we saw in the, let's say, the faux reformations of 2010 and beyond, it appeared that the military finally got it through their heads that you need to have at least a veneer of democratization. You need to have some level of visible reform and some reduction in cruelty in order to more effectively govern, in order to get better outcomes nationally. Why then do they continue to bounce back into this mentality of just squeeze the civilians more and somehow things will be good?
I mean, the first thing I'd say is I think it's difficult to get inside of the mentality, the mindsets, especially of the senior leadership of the military. At least for us and others, we've often tried to engage at times. We even tried to engage, with this most recent report in sending right of reply letters to try to get their response on issues, and they, to us, for years have been closed off. And so I think it's a real challenge to get them on the record, or even informally speaking to these things at all. I mean, I think in terms of conjecture, I think the military probably recognizes right now that it is facing a larger scale threat and opposition to its rule and to its practices than it has in a long time. And I think the response to that is then doubling down on what they've done in the past in order to maintain some sort of power and control. And that, I think, it's clear after decades of this, and that it's difficult to imagine that there is an ability for this leadership of the military to make inroads and actually gaining legitimacy with ethnic minorities that they have subjected to abuses for 20, 30, 40 years. And so instead, when now faced with a threat and an even, again, wider uprising and movement than in the past, they have doubled down and entrenched and are going back to the worst of their practices that we've seen.
So with that in mind, let's move forward to the actual report that Amnesty published, which I believe you and one of your colleagues worked on and published. What ultimately are the findings of the report? I mean, we will link the report down below for anybody who's interested in reading it. But in your own words, what are the key takeaways?
So we were on the Thailand-Myanmar border in March and April of this year, looking really in detail at the military operations starting from December of 2021 through right now. So looking in real time at the types of operations the military is undertaking in Karen and Karenni, or Cayenne and Kaya states in particular, and the crimes associated with those. And what we found, for example, is really, widespread assault on civilian populations through unlawful attacks by ground and air. So above all, we documented 24 attacks by artillery or mortars in which civilians were killed or injured, or in which civilian homes or other infrastructure were destroyed. And very often what this was is just the relentless firing of mortars into villages day and night for days at a time. And in many of the incidents that we looked at, there were no lawful targets in the area. There were no fighters from an ethnic armed organization nearby. There was no base of an ethnic armed organization or a PDF nearby. The military was just firing relentlessly mortars or artillery shells into villages. One example from March of this year, for example, people were gathering for a Buddhist religious festival. They were doing traditional Karen dance in the evening. And in the midst of that, 2 mortar shells landed right amid those who were doing the traditional dance, and it killed 3 civilians and injured 11 more. And it was one horrific incident, but it was one that was replicated again and again in what we were documenting. And we also documented a number of airstrikes on villages and even an IDP camp that was hit in January in the middle of the night. Again, killing 3 people, in this case, including 2 sisters, 15 and 12 years old. And this IDP camp, it should have been well known to the military. In any sort of aerial reconnaissance, you could see that this is a place where civilians were living. This has nothing to do with any sort of fighters or members of any armed group. And yet, again, the military is hitting these civilian areas over and over and over again, causing significant numbers of death and injuries, and ultimately leading to massive displacement across these areas. In addition, we found that many people, after they're displaced with nothing more than the clothes on their back and what little that they can carry. And after weeks or months in displacements, people often try to then sneak back to their villages to pick up a rice sack or whatever they could then bring back to their displacement site to feed themselves and their family. And very often, especially men or older boys who, if they're moving in these areas in eastern Myanmar, if they come across the military, if they come across the checkpoints or other positions of soldiers, they are arbitrarily detained, subjected to torture and other ill treatment, and in some cases are summarily executed. So we had a case that we documented from late January in Sanpia 6 Mile village in Karenni or Kaya states, where 3 men again tried to go back home in order to just pick up some vegetables, some basic food from their village, and their families never heard from them again. And it was several weeks later in early February that their bodies were found. They'd actually been thrown into a pit latrine after having been killed. And then when people tried to go and collect their bodies just to be able to bury them, a brother of one of the victims and others who tried to collect the bodies were then shot at by the military from a position nearby just as they tried to collect the bodies. And it was ultimately not until the end of March, 2 months after they went missing and some 6 weeks after the bodies were first found, before the family members were finally able to remove the bodies and to give them a proper burial. And again, just one example, but it speaks to a much wider pattern that we saw. And then the last kind of pattern that I'll talk about quickly is just pillaging and burning. And very often when the military is driving people away through this relentless attack by ground and air, that the soldiers then go into a village, where people have been forcibly displaced from, and they steal everything of value. They steal money, jewelry, livestock, clothes, rice, anything that they can take, they then truck away. And then at times we interviewed witnesses who described soldiers slashing rice sacks when they couldn't carry everything, to destroy a food supply that'll have an effect on these villages for months to come. That now the food that they harvested last year has been destroyed. And then in some areas, especially of Kayar, Karenni State, the military has systematically burned villages as it's moved through. So we could see, not just from witness testimony, but from satellite imagery that we have access to and that's included in the reports, that over a number of villages, as the military moved through, it burned large swaths of these villages, burning homes, burning markets, burning everything in some villages. In one village, for example, we were able to spot more than 250 structures. It was around 2/3 of the village that had been burned by the military over several periods in February and March of this year. And again, it speaks to this collective punishment of entire civilian populations in these areas that has profound effects today and is going to continue to have a profound effect on civilian populations in these areas for months and potentially years to come.
I mean, it's absolutely harrowing, the stories that we're hearing and the things that you're saying. They absolutely track with the stories that we've heard coming out of the west of the country, particularly in Chin State. We've heard the annual food supplies being stolen or being destroyed, and then on top of that, the fields being completely burned, making it impossible to grow food for the coming year. We've seen the mindless destruction of civilian houses in places like Tantlang, which has been hit multiple times by the military. And I know that on this podcast, we've actually interviewed Kumbedu of the Karenni Nationalities Defense Force, who similarly recounted that IDP camps were being repeatedly targeted by the military, even though the PDF were not hiding their location, and they were located dozens of miles away, specifically to avoid the excuse of military targets near villages and IDP centers. So it's absolutely grueling. But as unpleasant as the question may be, it has to be raised. What is the methodology, right? How can we be sure of these results? How can we be sure of these? I mean, we don't have government figures because there is no functioning government. The military is not likely to talk to us. We have a lot of people saying a lot of different things, but how can you be sure of the numbers that you have?
No, it's a great question and a really important one. And I think, the first thing to indicate is that in the way that we do our work at Amnesty and particular documentation that we're doing as the crisis response team, we are not, trying to come to a total number of civilians who have been killed or the total number of civilians who have been detained. I mean, there are, good numbers out there from organizations like the Assistance Association for Political Prisoners, who keep a very regular updating total on issues like that. The work that we are doing is far more about really going deep on a number of individual incidents to be able to establish patterns of violations by the military. And so, for example, when we document 8 airstrikes, is what we focused on in terms of airstrikes specifically in our report. And in doing that, to come to a place in which we feel confident in speaking about those airstrikes, we are interviewing, generally multiple direct witnesses to those specific airstrikes. We are then also using satellite imagery to check for craters or other indications of an airstrike to corroborate what we're hearing from witnesses. We have access to flight spotter information in which people are indicating that a fighter jet is taking off from a specific airport at a specific time, headed in the direction, for example, of Cayenne State. and then returns to that airport at that time. And then we can look at satellite imagery to make sure, are the type of fighter jet that the spotter is indicating, is that actually on the tarmac of that airport at that time? And if so, then it lines up as further, corroboration for it. We, both through people we interview who provide us with, photo material, video material of the aftermath of an airstrike, or things that are posted on social media, we then have people on our team in what we call the evidence lab at Amnesty, who specialize in verifying that that photograph or that video is actually from the village where it's indicated and from the date and time indicated. And so ultimately then, we were able to piece all of these different sorts of evidence together, from testimony from witnesses to satellite imagery to photo and video material to flight spotter info. All of this comes together to be able to then feel that for this specific incident, we have enough evidence to feel very confident in what we're saying about what happened on that day at that time. And then if you build enough of those incidents together in a similar way, that ultimately then you can establish with confidence, again, that the patterns of how the military is carrying out attacks by air or with mortars. And so we can, from those specific incidents, feel very confident in the specific number of people, or at least a certain number of people who were killed and injured in those specific incidents, which is generally our focus, as opposed to being able to capture all of the civilian casualties that have happened in eastern Myanmar, much less across the entire country since the coup.
Wow, so pretty comprehensive stuff, and it is interesting to know that you're talking about things like craters. You're talking about seeing a physical plane on a tarmac. Like, there is a lot of physical evidence available that you might not imagine, because we see soldiers do things. If we're lucky enough to get a recording of it, we see houses burning. Obviously, you can't hide the fact that a house has been burned down, but something like being able to count craters of airstrikes, I mean, that's pretty solid, pretty reliable. It's not something that I would have thought of. But I want to talk about footage specifically. We've seen with other crises, obviously Ukraine has dominated the media. We've seen a lot of footage of rocket strikes. We've seen footage of the aftermath of crimes being uncovered. We've seen a lot of footage of captured soldiers confessing. And there is just a lot of visual evidence direct from the ground that helps to really spread the information, spread awareness, and has really helped to capture the attention of the international community. While by contrast in Myanmar, in many of these regions which are hardest hit, there has been an absence of electricity for extended periods of time. Many of these regions have been in extended internet blackouts. Is that sort of thing something that is hindering our understanding of the true scale of what's going on? Is that something that's hindered your work in any way?
I think it has had an impact on how closely the international community, media, and others are following the situation, and it's I think this is part of the military's strategy. They cut off communications. They monitor communications when they're not cut off, such that it makes it dangerous from a security perspective, for people who are trying to compile this sort of evidence inside, and all of that then means that there is less coming out here than in other places. And we also see that in terms of the sheer access, inside the country, documenting violations by local civil society groups who are doing unbelievable work, but at enormous risk. And of course, without the military's authorization to do this work in the first place, to document. And so you contrast that to to a situation, like Ukraine, where there is an enormous presence in the country of international media, of human rights actors, of others who are able to get to sites and to then put that information out immediately. Whereas the military, by really shutting down the country, by arresting activists, by cutting off the country from UN human rights actors, from other sorts of international investigators, it's a deliberate effort to keep this information from getting out. And unfortunately, it is then having success in that when you look at the attention paid to the situation in Myanmar by the UN Security Council or by other major multinational bodies, it's embarrassingly limited, despite the fact that we know the enormous human cost of what's happening right now in Myanmar. And so there is a desperate need, in fact, all the more so because of how far the military is going to blocking information, that the international community really needs to redouble its efforts to bring attention to what's happening on the ground, because without that, it will continue to stay out of the headlines and out of the attention in a way even as civilians continue to suffer on a massive scale.
And so let's talk about that suffering, and let's talk about how the situation is unfolding, because we've seen in the past, obviously, a lot of these tactics that we've already discussed, but let's focus on the differences. This conflict has been described as the first of its kind. There have been many conflicts in Myanmar, but there have been many firsts following the coup. Unprecedented levels of unification and cooperation between EAOs. We've seen the ethnic Burma joining resistance organizations by the thousands, and collaboration between the ethnic Burma and the EAOs again for the first time on this scale that we've ever seen. But as far as the military is concerned, how have their tactics changed, if at all?
I think the number one way that their tactics have changed have been through the increasing reliance on airstrikes, and they've used airstrikes in the past. I mean, I've documented airstrikes at times in the conflicts in Kachin and Northern Shan State back in 2017, or in Rakhine State against the Arakan Army in 2018, 2019. But when you compare the intensity, the frequency of airstrikes in those conflicts in the past versus what's happening right now in eastern Myanmar, it's of an entirely different scale. And so the way that they are pounding civilian areas as well as positions of the EAOs and PDFs with airstrikes is really of a different order from what we've seen in the past. And that's having profound impacts on the civilian population. I mean, there were a number of people that we interviewed who, they are terrorized, traumatized every time they hear an airplane flying by. Even if that's just not to actually fire a missile or to launch another sort of attack. I mean, at this stage, the mere flying of military aircraft, or even any aircraft in this area, has such a profound impact on mental health of people in the area. I mean, such that people were describing to us, especially because of the airstrikes at night, and also at times the mortar attacks at night. People are sleeping underneath the stilts of their homes because they can't feel any safety to sleep inside their home at night because of the way that the military has attacked. And I think that's it's related, but also a second difference is how often attacks right now are happening at nighttime, as opposed to, at least when I've documented military operations in the past and in other parts of the country, primarily those operations were taking place during the day. The firing was taking place during the day, whereas now, whether it's with mortars, whether it's with airstrikes, you have just so much firing throughout the night. And again, what that means in terms of people not feeling they can be in their villages safely, even at nighttime to sleep. And so people have then fled further and further from their village to a displacement site, and then ultimately to caves or very deep in the jungle, because it's only there that they can find any sort of refuge from the relentless assault by the military. But while there may be a bit more safety, security from airstrikes or mortar fire in those extremely remote areas, it's been much harder to access people with humanitarian assistance or assistance of any kind. And so that also then has a further knock-on effect in terms of people's access to food and water and the most basic of healthcare. And it all again stems from this pounding of civilian areas day and night with airstrikes and artillery and mortar fire.
And it's something that I've heard, and I don't know how accurate that is, but basically what I'm being told is that this reliance on airstrikes just comes from the fact that on the ground, the military is not as effective as they thought that they would be. They're excellent, obviously, when they're shelling a village or when they're just firing indiscriminately into civilian crowds. But when they're actually faced with armed resistance, they're borderline useless. And so they're relying very heavily on shelling, and they're relying very heavily on airstrikes, and they're relying very heavily on attack helicopters in order to gain that strategic edge. But what you've been saying this whole time is basically that it isn't even strategic. It's not that they're using air superiority to fight back against the PDF. They're using their air superiority, if I'm understanding correctly, to double down on assaulting civilian targets and civilian settlements. Would that be fair?
It's a combination of the two. It's absolutely the case that in many of these instances, it is just directing that fire at civilian populations as part of instilling this fear and punishment. I guess if when we're trying to venture a guess, I think it does also go back to the historic four cuts policy and idea, and in so doing, they are driving people out of these villages, and I guess in their perception, then making it harder on whether it's the EAOs or PDFs in terms of not having civilian presence throughout these areas, because they're being driven to more and more remote areas. But that is a incredibly, as you said, in terms of there's no long-term strategic thought there, or certainly ability to ever come back from that and be seen as a force that respects the rights of ethnic minorities in this area, when they have subjected them to this relentless barrage for more than a year now.
So let's now sort of expand our scope a little bit and start thinking about what can be done. We're obviously dealing with a humanitarian crisis, but I wonder if there's any way that you can help to illustrate the scale that we're talking about. So this is a country of 54 million people, give or take. If the war ended tomorrow, let's say the military lays down their arms and they just disappear, what is still the scale of humanitarian crisis with regards to things like COVID, with regard to things like displacement and homelessness, with regards to things like power insecurity, food insecurity, all these sorts of issues compounded? How big of a problem are we talking about?
Yeah, it's a really important question. And I think there's several things here. First is if we start again, looking at Eastern Myanmar, in a state like Kaya, Karenni, at this point, it's between a third to a half of the entire population of that state is displaced. So in terms of the proportion of the impact of the conflicts right now and the military's abuses, it's enormous in these areas in terms of just how many people, percentage of people who've been driven from their homes. Then you add to that the fact that, many of the homes have been damaged or destroyed by airstrikes or mortar fire, or they have been burned to the ground systematically, by the military. What that would entail in terms of rebuilding, all of that infrastructure will be enormous. You add to that the fact that the military is, as we talked about, systematically pillaging, many of the villages that they're taking. And so the wealth that's been pulled away, the basic mechanisms of livelihoods that are being pulled away in terms of, people's livestock and even just the cash that they hold in their home, and all of that now being, stolen in certain villages or certain areas. And what that means for people's ability to rebuild their lives. I remember in particular, there was this older woman who I interviewed. She was in her 70s, and she had been driven from her village and went back a couple of days later to find that the military had ransacked, her home, stolen all the money. And what she told me is that money that she had in her home is money that her children and grandchildren had sent her to be able to prepare for medical needs and health needs that she would have at this stage of her life. And now that all has been taken away because of the military's pillaging. And again, this is the case for tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people in conflict areas. And then, adding on top of that, you have that right now is the planting season. This is when people need to start preparing, start the process of farming for what will be the next harvest. And so many of them are displaced. They're away from their homes, away from their villages, and can't go back to them safely. And so you not only have a crisis of now in terms of the homes burned and the food stolen, but you have a crisis that's going to get likely significantly worse because many people are not able to now, plant in order to harvest in the coming season. And so what that will mean for long-term food insecurity is enormous. And then finally, you have a real decimation of the health infrastructure in these areas. And that happens because, hospitals and other health facilities have been bombed. It happens because people have been forced to flee from, many of the towns where the bigger hospitals or health facilities were, to go, again, deeper into the jungle or into caves for their safety. And that means, that everything from, as you said, the COVID-19 response to vaccinations more generally for kids and others, to just the basic infrastructure for primary healthcare has been decimated throughout these areas, and that will have long-term ramifications. And so there's an enormous need now to get far more creative with the humanitarian response, to scale up that response and to find creative ways to make sure that assistance is getting through to these communities that are hardest hit. Because without it, again, the situation is already quite dire, and it is likely to get significantly more so.
So let's talk about the response itself. Very disturbingly, we have seen that ASEAN has agreed as part of their response package to use the aid distribution mechanisms that are overseen by the military. And unsurprisingly, even on paper, the military's distribution mechanism is designed to benefit those areas that are under firm military control, that are in the center of the country, that are Burma-dominated, and would not include places like Chin State or Karenni State, which have been very, very aggressively hit by the military. But even straying away from the theory, I personally have heard reports, although I can't corroborate them, that some of the things being sent in aid wind up being sold for cash in markets. That there is widespread corruption, and there is basically just the exploitation of international aid for personal gain and personal profit. Now, the question is, what obstacles are being faced by actors who want to help distribute aid in actually making sure that that aid gets to the communities that need it the most?
Yeah, I mean, this is, I think, one of the most pressing questions and one of the most pressing issues to try to get resolved or to get significant improvements on. I think, you first have the long-standing military obstructionism that we saw even prior to the coup in terms of humanitarian response in conflict areas, where they, the number of hoops that a humanitarian actor has to jump through in terms of the different authorizations and the fact that those are ever changing, and the person that you have to go to this week is changed by the next week, and it's all a kind of delay tactic to make the delivery of assistance as difficult and as controlled as possible. But then you have a second level, particularly, and as you said as well, from what you've heard, in areas that are controlled by or largely administered by ethnic armed organizations, where there's a much more complete blocking of, or at least extreme limiting of the assistance that gets through. And, for example, for the report that we just published, interviewed doctors and nurses and others who were trying to move aid, specifically, medical supplies and medications, through to EAO controlled areas, and had several incidents in which, vehicles that were bringing medical supplies destined for civilians in these areas were not only stopped by the military, but the goods on board were actively seized by the military. And this is something that others have documented and reported on as well. And so you have, again, the manipulation of humanitarian assistance, or the ability to deliver life-saving aid, is part and parcel of this wider strategy of collective punishment. The ability to choke off assistance that's destined for civilians in EAO-controlled parts of the country is, for the military, just another part of the types of war crimes and what we have said are likely crimes against humanity being committed against civilians in these areas.
And so what is the international response looking like? Because we've got some in the international community who say that they want to help, but they really don't do much. You've got some in the international community who will help, but because they are apolitical and they don't want to take the risk, they're willing to use the military's own distribution methodology and the military's own systems. And it's laughable, but this is something that we've seen all the way going back to Cyclone Nargis, and those who remember the corruption surrounding that, when the military temporarily changed the exchange rate from 1,000 kyat to the dollar to 6 kyat to the dollar, so that they could pocket the difference. It's something that we know is not useful, and yet many international aid organizations have felt compelled to use these channels, which they know are corrupt, in the hopes of at least getting something through. And then, of course, you do have organizations who are principled and they say, no, we're not going to work with the military. But they are, as you've noted, facing a lot of obstacles. And in a lot of cases, getting aid to places like Chin State or Karen State, Karenni State, can mean literally illegally smuggling goods across borders. So it's a very difficult situation for the international community, whether it's government or whether it's NGO. And I don't envy the decisions that they have to make. But what are we generally looking at? How is the international community leaning between these options?
I think the first thing that needs to be done is actually far more consistent communication with the civil society organizations on both sides of the border in these areas, who have been navigating these dynamics for years, if not decades in many cases, and who have far better and I think more creative ideas about how to manage this and how to make sure assistance is getting to the people who need it most, because they live and work in these settings in in a way that gives an insight that's fundamentally deeper and more profound. And so I think that the starting point needs to be engaging with them around how delivery can best be done so as to actually reach those who need it most. And then that then needs to include pressure on or discussions with the Thai authorities, if we're talking about Karen and Karenni, for example, to make sure that assistance can move across the border, and in such a way that you don't have to rely on the military. There are areas around here that are around that part of the border that are controlled by ethnic armed organizations, that are administered by ethnic armed organizations. And so there needs to be a lot more creativity about moving assistance through those areas such that it reaches civilians who are being hit consistently by the military. In other parts of the country, I think there's going to have to, of course, be navigating of the military, the SAC dynamics when you're talking about areas that it controls to varying degrees. But there are many of these areas that it doesn't control, and so if we're adopting an approach in which everything has to go through the military, or by definition, then you are ignoring significant parts of the country that are being hammered by the military and where there's a desperate need for assistance to get through.
And so, coming back to the Amnesty report that you've that you co-authored, what impact, if anything, do you expect that report is going to have on the international community? I mean, Amnesty International is a very highly respected organization, and their words carry significant weight. But do you expect that your report is going to help motivate these sorts of changes that you're talking about in the international response?
I mean, we will certainly try for that. We have done meetings in New York with UN Security Council members. We've done meetings with the U.S. government. We've done meetings with other governments. We've met with representatives from ASEAN countries, and so we are trying to make sure that our findings and the enormous needs and really the nature of the military's crimes, which are consistently war crimes and likely crimes against humanity, that this is getting to actors who have the ability to influence the situation on the ground, getting to them directly recommendations that we're making around the humanitarian situation and how best to respond to it, but also around issues of accountability and around an arms embargo. I mean, we believe deeply that there needs to be a comprehensive arms embargo imposed on Myanmar. At this stage, how could it be any clearer that any weapon sold or transferred to the Myanmar military is very likely to be used against civilians? We've seen this again and again. We see it every day in different parts of the country. And so we need to see the flow of weapons into Myanmar stopped. And that includes things like military-grade aviation fuel that are then used in the fighter jets that are pounding civilian areas. And so there's a number of pressure points that can be put on the military to try to limit its ability to inflict such devastation on civilians. And ultimately, if we're talking about longer term and what's needed, we need to see justice, real accountability for the military's crimes, the crimes that it's committing right now in eastern Myanmar, the crimes that it's committing right now in Chin and Sagaing and elsewhere, and the crimes that it's committed, both in the past and now against the Rohingya and other populations across the country. And so it's only through accountability, through a real reckoning with the military's crimes and the way that is operated for decades, that we're likely to see a move out of this and to the ability to see a military and a government more generally that respects the rights of all of those across the country as opposed to what we've seen now for far too long. And again, particularly in the aftermath of the coup, in which those weapons are repeatedly trained on civilians.
So I think you've touched on some very important points here. And the first one, I want to go back to something you just said. How clearer could it be that weapons sold to the military are going to be used for murdering civilians? I think you've kind of hit the nail on the head and also opened the window onto a broader question here. They know. The only country in the United Nations that actively opposed arms embargoes on Myanmar was, shock horror, Belarus. And they are themselves a military dictatorship. The countries who are supporting the junta openly, whether it's Russia, whether it's I've heard reports, though I can't corroborate them, that they've been engaging with the Revolutionary Guard of Iran, whether it's China as tacitly as they're doing it. These countries know full well what those resources, whether it's aviation parts, and we've just seen the UK putting sanctions on 3 Russian agencies that sell aviation parts for the military to repair their aircraft, or whether it's ammunition, whether it's arms, whether it's aviation fuel, what have you. They know exactly what it's going to be used for. The Amnesty report is not going to make a difference on that. They're fully aware of this. So what is it that we can do internationally to strangle this trade of the tools of murder, when information is not the issue? It's apathy and an indifference to suffering that is driving it.
I think the first thing I'd say is I agree for the most part with how you framed that. But I do think while there is lots of information out there, if you look, for example, at how the UN Security Council has treated Myanmar versus other crises around the world, it has held no open meetings in a really long time on Myanmar, and even the closed door meetings are incredibly rare. And so even the active discussions, open discussions in the international fora where this is meant to be debated and discussed and to have information put in the public domain in front of countries around the world, it's not happening on Myanmar in the way that it is for other crises. And that to me is one of the first things that has to change. And we need to see countries, and I think it's often too easy for countries to look at, a Russia veto or a China veto, and to then not, make the effort to make the push to at least force, that veto, force China to have to make the decision to veto a resolution on a strong resolution on Myanmar, as opposed to often now we end up in a situation in which, countries are in effect kind of censoring themselves or keeping this out of the public domain, looking for a consensus that we all know is not, coming quickly. And so we need to see far more discussion on this, because it lowers the costs for the military and for those who are protecting it when very little discussion is happening in a public domain. And then the second thing I'd say is that, there are, while it's true that many of those actors that you just named, their opinions will not change from an Amnesty report or a UN report, or again, the incredible work being done by civil society organizations on the ground. But there are other ways to squeeze this at least a little bit to have an effect. It's not only those countries who are involved in the movement of fuel, of aviation fuel, for example, into the country that ultimately reaches the military. And there are ways, whether it's through financial sanctions on those who are responsible for human rights abuses, whether it is making much more real the possibility of criminal investigation for the military's crimes. There needs to be far more attention paid and then creativity given in terms of finding ways to to make it more difficult for the military to continue to commit these sorts of violations and to really escalate the pressure and the consequences for when it does.
And so I'm glad you moved in that direction, because that's something that I wanted to move on to now, and that's the question of legal recourse. And I think it's a very complex, tricky situation when we look at something like this. Domestic legislation in Myanmar is complicated, but basically for decades, obviously, the military have been writing their own laws, and not only writing their own laws, but writing their own constitutions to underpin those laws. And prosecutions domestically under legislation that has been passed by the CRPH would be quite contentious. Myanmar is not a signatory to the Rome Statute, so that puts limitations on the impact that the International Criminal Court can have. Even the Rohingya genocide case was brought in the International Court of Justice by the Gambia against Myanmar as a whole, as the International Court of Justice has to target countries as a whole, not individual actors within those countries, as the ICC would be able to do. I've heard people arguing that the Geneva Conventions, to which Myanmar is a signatory, do open the door to any signatory state carrying out prosecutions, as long as any of the members of the junta voluntarily leave Myanmar and subject themselves to the possibility of arrest and prosecution on those grounds. But what do you think is the most likely or the most effective form of legal recourse moving forward against the junta?
Well, I think your question actually touches on the most important strategy here, which is that all options need to be on the table, and we need all actors who can play a role in justice and accountability for the military's crimes to be doing so. For the International Criminal Court, for example, the UN Security Council can and should refer the situation in Myanmar to the ICC. So even with the fact that Myanmar is not a party to the Rome Statute, if the UN Security Council were to make a referral, that would allow the ICC to investigate and ultimately prosecute crimes committed across the entire country. As of now, there is a investigation that's ongoing, specifically related to a certain set of crimes committed by the military against the Rohingya. That's based on the fact that Bangladesh is a state party, and so where there's a sufficient nexus of crimes to a state party like Bangladesh that they can be investigated by the International Criminal Court. And so that's underway, but there are crimes being committed all across the country, and so a UN Security Council referral would allow for the prosecutor of the ICC to investigate the full range of the military's crimes throughout the country against all ethnic minorities, and today also against the Bamar in the context of the uprising after the coup. In addition, we have the IIMM that was set up and that is building criminal investigations, case files against individuals in the military. They have said openly in public communications that includes crimes committed in the aftermath of the coup, that their investigations are looking into crimes committed in the aftermath of the coup. So that body, needs more support, both financially and also in its access to make sure that it can get to other countries in the region where it would best be able to build investigations that ultimately it may not be today or a month from now, but by building those investigations right now in this moment when evidence is fresh, it can allow for prosecutions down the road in a variety of different jurisdictions when the day may come that the situation changes such that it may be more feasible to bring prosecutions against senior leaders of the military. And then finally, and it goes to a point you raised, countries around the world, many of them can exercise jurisdiction under what's known as universal jurisdiction. The crimes that the military has committed, crimes against humanity. In the case of the Rohingya, the UN has said likely genocide, and of course, war crimes throughout these contexts. Those are of such a gravity that they can be investigated by other countries. Often, for example, as you alluded to, if a member of the military were to travel to a particular country and could then be arrested there for crimes committed in Myanmar. And so we need all of these efforts taking place simultaneously, along with targeted sanctions against those responsible for human rights violations, so that even if they're not facing a court of law right now, they are facing consequences for their human rights violations. And likewise, again, as we've already talked about, stopping the flow of weapons and other things like that. So we need to see all options, really on the table, and support for them, by countries around the world, in order to maximize the pressure on the military related to these horrific abuses that have been going on for a while and that continue every day now.
I think that's very comprehensive. So Matt, look, I want to thank you for coming on and for sharing this information. And I just want to give you the opportunity to leave the audience with your final thoughts on this issue. I know it's a very big topic. I know there's a lot going on here, and I want to make sure that you have the chance to let the audience mull over the most important points of what we've discussed here today. So please, if you have any thoughts, I'd like you to share them.
I think the two things that I would really want to leave people with is first that it's on all of us to try to bring more attention to the situation here, and to make sure that our governments, wherever we are in the world, are likewise putting priority on this. I think it's been clear to all of us working on Myanmar that the international focus has largely moved away, that there was there was concerted attention in the first weeks, months after the coup, but at this point, the international community is paying very little attention to the situation in Myanmar, and that emboldens the military to continue to commit these sorts of horrific violations against civilians. And so there needs to be, from all of us, pressure on our governments, pressure on our media outlets to cover the situation in Myanmar and to make sure that it gets the attention that it deserves, given the situation that people are facing on the ground. And the second is that, both from a humanitarian and a human rights response, that organizations on the ground are really doing unbelievable work on both sides of the border, in places like eastern Myanmar into Thailand, and then throughout other parts of Myanmar, and they're doing so at incredible risk and in the most challenging of circumstances. And there is a need from donors and others to significantly increase support to these frontline organizations who are responding to these crises every single day, and combined with that, if we can get more attention and more support for these organizations, that will significantly help in the short term. And then on top of that, again, for all that we have talked about here in terms of the need for justice and accountability, and ultimately the only way that this is going to change is if the military is brought to justice for the crimes it's committing right now in the East, the crimes it's committing right now in places like Chen and Sagaing, and then the crimes that it has committed in recent years as well. If we really want to see a move towards a country, government ultimately, that respects the rights of all those across Myanmar, that's only going to happen through a reckoning of the military with the military's crimes and ultimately justice for those crimes.
We'd like to take this time to thank our generous supporters who have already given. We simply cannot continue to provide you with this content and information without the wonderful support of generous listeners, donors, and friends like you. Each episode helps in providing access to one more voice, one more perspective, one more insight. Every donation of any size is greatly appreciated, and it helps us to continue this mission. We greatly appreciate your generosity, which allows us to maintain this platform and everything else we do. If you would like to join in our mission to support those in Myanmar who are being impacted by the military coup, we welcome your contribution in any form, currency, or transfer method. Your donation will go to support a wide range of humanitarian missions, aiding those local communities who need it most. Donations are directed to such causes as the Civil Disobedience Movement, CDM, families of deceased victims, internally displaced person, IDP camps, food for impoverished communities, military defection campaigns, undercover journalists, monasteries and nunneries, education initiatives, the purchasing of protective equipment and medical supplies, COVID relief, and much more. We also make sure that our donation fund supports a diverse range of religious and ethnic groups across the country. We invite you to visit our website to learn more about past projects as well as upcoming needs. You can give a general donation or earmark your contribution for a specific activity or project you would like to support, perhaps even something you heard about in this very episode. All of this humanitarian aid work is carried out by our nonprofit mission, Better Burma. Any donation you give on our Insight Myanmar website is directed towards this fund. Alternatively, you can also visit the Better Burma website, betterburma.org. That's BETTERBURMA.org, and donate directly there. In either case, your donation goes to the same cause, and both websites accept credit cards. You can also give via PayPal by going to paypal.me/betterburma. Additionally, we take donations through Patreon, Venmo, GoFundMe, and Cash App. Simply search Better Burma on each platform and you'll find our account. You can also visit either the Insight Myanmar or Better Burma websites for specific links to those respective accounts, or email us at info@betterburma.org. If you'd like to give in another way, please contact us. Thank you so much for your kind consideration and support.